topic was more of a Brian Windhorst thing that he said on his podcast that the Pistons could look to make a midseason upgrade. So I'll kind of change the question this way for you guys. What do you kind of think a midseason upgrade may be? Is it a certain skill type you think the Pistons are looking for that they currently don't have? Or maybe it's a position you think that they're a little weak at in terms of the depth chart?
I think a lot of it's going to depend on obviously how they do throughout the season, but I think, like at the very least, we know that they have a trade exception to their disposal. We know that that there's real opportunities, for them to maneuver the roster. I think just based off of the types of players that Trajan's added, I wouldn't be surprised if it's yet another wing, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's another like 3-and-D specialist. To me, like when I look at players that I'm just interested to see what happens, like a personal, like I know he's a guy that's been popular in like the Pistons Twitter sphere as well, but PJ Washington with Dallas, going like Cooper Flagg being drafted there. I know, they love him in Dallas, but like there's the real question of how they fit alongside each other. And, like depending on how that goes in Dallas this season, that they could potentially look to alter how that roster is shaped. And so that wouldn't particularly surprise me if like that came up as, like a potential option. I think someone in that like type of vein is, I think, who they're going to look for, like just like a dependable, like veteran who can give you quality spacing and, like quality play on both levels. Someone that, like can start if you need him to, but also you can bring off the bench and, like there's maneuverability with it. I don't think they're necessarily, like they could go out and get a big name for all we know this year. I just, based off of what we know about Trajan and just the way he likes to play things, like I don't think he's not rushing anything. So I think like he's just looking to like, like bolster depth and just continue to take incremental steps. That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, PJ Washington was a name that I had on one of my targets as well. I think Trajan is very intentional. Even when Ivy went down, obviously he made it very clear that they were trying to add a point guard. Even before the season started, they were talking to Tyus Jones and looking at other backup point guards that they could bring into the fold to help out with their depth. And I still think that's what the plan is for them. Again, I agree with Sean. I don't think they're going to rush anything or crash out for, the first big name that they see or, anything like that. I feel like he wants to be very intentional and patient with the development of this team. And I feel like they do have the affordability to do that. I feel like there's a lot of teams that could have some guys potentially on the move. I feel like teams like New Orleans, a lot of the bottom feeders on both conferences side, I feel like they're going to have pieces that they could have available as soon as the trade deadline. And like Winnie said, I do expect the Pistons to be active. I feel like they understand how important, like Trajan talked about it after the season. He says he understands how important and how big it was that they did make the playoffs, ahead of schedule to the public. They believe they could do it, which is awesome. So to kind of know that they were able to get to that point and they don't really want to take a step back, I think he understands that. And I think he knows that making that perfect pick is going to be very, very vital in terms of how they progress. Again, not just for this upcoming season. He said he wants to build this thing up for the next 5 to 10 years. So I, expect him to be very intentional. I think he's looking at certain positions that make the most sense. Stretch fours, wings. He puts a lot of value in that in off seasons all the time with his drafting, free agency. So I expect him to kind of have that same mindset in terms of the trade deadline because it's going to be a big period when it comes up for the Pistons.
Let me ask you guys this. Let's say Pistons are top 4 in the East, like right before the deadline. Mm-hmm. You think they push all their chips in to try to, challenge the New Yorks, the Clevelands, the Orlandos, and saying that's how the East goes? Do you think they try to push their chips in if they're a top 4 team versus maybe, let's say they're like an 8 seed and, they have injuries? Do you think they still go all in, or do you think they would kind of just tread carefully and still try to evaluate the team for the remainder of the season?
I'm going to guess he would still take the baby steps and just lean on the young guys. I feel like knowing that they were able to, stay toe-to-toe with the Knicks last season in the playoffs, like if they got waxed in 5 games, like I don't think people will be surprised. They'll be like, all right, they're battle-tested. They have stars. Brunson's an ascending player. It is what it is. And I don't think people will be too upset. I think fans would just be happy that they were able to get into the playoffs. But the fact that they were able to take that step, I mean, you could argue even that would be a reason to make that cash in. But again, the fact that the young players were able to do so much in keeping them competitive. It's not like Tobias was averaging 25 or Beasley was carrying the water to score. Every young player stepped up. There's no one player in the young core that the Pistons are waiting for them to develop. And okay, let's catch on. Come on, Ivy, or come on, Asar. The fact that everybody took a step forward, I think gives him the credence and the reason to want to take their time. And I feel like that's the way he's looking at it personally.
Yeah. And I also just looking at Keith Smith, who's a really good, like cap, like he's like the cap goat of like basketball Twitter, but also just a really good reporter. And the summer league intel dump that he did a couple of weeks ago is just absolute gold. And like just a lot of good stuff in there. Like one of the things was how just about every single team brought up the second apron and like their fears. One GM in the Eastern Conference said, we're never going to be in the second apron. That is just something we are never going to do. But like with like when it comes to the Pistons, a quote that I just found really interesting and, in there, like pertaining to this conversation, it was actually, a part of his intel, like on extension talks with Ivy and Duran. But like in the quote, it says, we're not the cap space Pistons anymore. We're the playoff Pistons now. Right. If we want to keep being the playoff Pistons, we need to be really smart from here on out. That means finding the right deal for us and for our players. And so like, that's why, like, I think this is just this is like the most cap conscious front office that we've ever had. And that's before all of the strict cap rules that are in the league right now.
I want to say that reads like an Arn Tellem quote, like straight up in my head. Like, if you would have told me, like, okay, who said this? That sounds like an Arn Tellem quote if I've ever heard one before. But I'm glad you brought that up because, like, in that same article, they said we feel pretty confident that we can get extensions done with not only Jalen Durham but also Jaden Ivey, that we can get a deal done, which I think kind of just points to what the Pistons are trying to do long term of keeping the core together, kind of having that Oklahoma City Thunder approach of drafting well and keeping the core intact. But this is a really good question because I don't really know what direction they're going to go in. I'm with you. I've kind of looked at PJ Washington being on an expiring contract. He fits right into that exception if they want to do it that way. But I think if you kind of look at the contracts that they gave out, there's a lot of stackable contracts. Like, Tobias isn't expiring. Karis LeVert can get you to that 40, 50 million point. Like, you could possibly be a player for maybe a Lauri Markkanen. Maybe you feel like you're a Lauri Markkanen away of, kind of upgrading the roster. You kind of look at the contracts that they have, like they can actually go like big fish hunting and, go after guys that are making $40, $50 million contracts if they feel that's what the Pistons are kind of missing on their roster. I know a big move is coming. I just don't think it's going to be as big as like the last big move they made. I don't think it's going to be a Blake Griffin-esque, but I think it will be a marginal move that does help them not only win a playoff series, but possibly get them to the Eastern Conference Finals. Like that's how like positively I think about this front office and the way they've positioned themselves and all the contracts they've given out. You guys are very short-term money. They're not committing long-term to anybody outside of really Cade and Isaiah Stewart on this roster. So I think they're setting themselves up to really make that next big move.
Yep. They're setting themselves up to be able to to maneuver with their roster while being able to sign their players to extensions that they have. And like, because again, it's important to keep in mind, like this is before the, the Asar Thompson contract, like extension talks where I think like Duren and Ivy, like I think it's going to be interesting to see, and there's like a lot of debate on what those numbers could look like. If I'm being honest, if Asar comes out and plays the way that we think he can, there's not going to be a lot of debate. It's just going to be give him as much money as you're allowed to, and then put pen to paper and let it dry.
I just want to, I'm hoping whatever the move makes or whenever the move is made and whenever it's made, hopefully it's in response to the necessity of just needing to fill a hole instead of replacing an injury. Because the most important thing for them to do, while yes, they could add a few more pieces and, make one of those splashes, but the most important thing that they need is that core has to play at least 60 plus games together. That has to happen this season. They don't I don't want to see any of those guys go down where they're, watching the street close in the playoffs like Ivy and Stewart had to do. Like they need them all to be healthy because they all fill different roles, which is why they're so important. It's not like you're seeing, a core of guys where they're meshing or not, they're not meshing and they can't really, find a vibe. Like Cade is obviously the focal point guy. Ivy has his lane. Asar has his lane. Duren has his lane. Like they all have their own specific, ways of contributing to this team, which is why it's going to be so important for them to stay healthy and play together and grow together. So hopefully they can make that decision and that move with a healthy roster intact next to them.